Thank you. So for folks, I see a lot of friendly faces and kind of familiar names in the participants today, but and a lot of new ones as well. So if we haven't met before, my name is Georgina Donahue. I'm the Director of Community here at Pragmatic. And Pragmatic has a really robust community that is full of alumni who are really brilliant, love to share their ideas and thoughts. One of the best parts about my role and about Pragmatic's community is that we get to connect you with folks like Mike Mace and really dig into these amazing thought leadership topics. But we do a bunch of other stuff as well. We have an online community space where you can ask a question to your peers and get kind of like real world, been there, done that answers and ideas. And then we also make sure that you can connect with instructors, Pragmatic instructors every week in office hours. So tons of ways for you to stay plugged in, and highly recommend that you take advantage of that. We can cruise right on over to the next slide when you're ready for it, Mike. Today, we are really going to be talking about the future. And I admit, we can't actually predict the future. So if that's what you tuned in for, I won't hold it against you if you want to drop off now. I don't have the mystery and the secrets of the universe, but that's no reason to give up on long-term planning completely, right? You know, we can't predict the future, but we don't only want to focus on reactions to market changes. So today we get to chat with Mike Mace about where that middle ground is between over planning and only reacting to things. Mike is amazing. He's a 25-year veteran in the tech industry. Don't blush. I see him wanting to blush, but he's got awesome experience in software and in hardware companies. He was the head of Mac platform marketing at Apple, VP of product planning at Palm, and he's the current VP of market strategy at UserTesting. So we're just totally delighted to talk to him. We're going to be able to pick his brain. He's going to share some ideas with us about how we identify what's possible versus what's impossible, right? Impossible predicting the future, but a whole other world of what is possible for you. We're going to talk a little bit about how to tell when a theoretical opportunity is likely to turn into something practical you can really get your hands on, and how you outmaneuver the competition along the way. So it's my pleasure to turn over the reins. Mike, we're totally delighted to have you here. Welcome. Thanks for joining.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for such a nice intro. I mean, now we've set everybody's expectations really high. I'll try to live up to it. And thank you everybody for turning out for this. I'm really interested in your thoughts on all of this. It is very much my ideas about this stuff after being in the tech industry for a long time. So I do not pretend at all that I have all the answers. Think of this more as a way of getting a perspective and a discussion going. And so I will be very interested in your feedback, your disagreements, your questions, your ideas, all of that sort of stuff. I'd love to hear it today, but also offline. Otherwise, it'd be great to get feedback on it. So now, with all that set up, let me give you a summary of what I want to talk about today. So number one, when you look at the future in general, we as an industry, and I think the world in general, we are horrible at predicting the future. Just awful, awful, awful. And this is a leading cause of death for companies when you look at history, and I'll give you some examples of that sort of stuff. Companies tend to cope with the uncertainties about the future in a couple of ways, both of which have their own predictable flaws. And so I want to talk about that and how to compensate for those things. I think the most important way to compensate for it is to just have a different attitude toward the future, rather than thinking about it either as something that you cannot predict at all, and therefore you need to just react, or thinking about it as something that you can kind of, through your brilliant intellectual powers, that you can actually control and cause to happen. Neither of those really work. There's a middle ground where you look at what's possible and you figure out how to kind of modify the future a little bit without trying to completely drive it. And I want to talk to you about how that all plays out. And this is something that I've tried to do at companies in the past and some of the teams that I've set up. And so I want to talk about specific practical stuff about combining customer information and tech information and competitor information to help you think about things that could happen in the future. So here's the agenda. I want to warn you that this presentation is front-loaded with theory, and then I talk about practical stuff at the end. There are a lot of people in their personalities, they love theory, so you're going to have fun right up front. There are other people who in their personalities really want to get to the practical stuff and would prefer to have only half a slide on theory. I apologize, you're going to have to put up with it, but I promise we'll get to some practical advice at the end. So I'm going to talk about the trouble with predicting the future to really to define exactly what the problem is. We'll talk about the ways that companies cope and the vulnerabilities that creates. Third, we'll talk about this different way to look at the future that I want you to think about. And then we'll close with stuff to do. And then, of course, questions and discussions at the end. So to set this all up, I'm going to unfairly pick on a very popular business book from the 1990s. So if you've been around long enough like me, you will probably remember this book. It's called Competing for the Future. This was one of the best-selling business books of the entire 1990s. It framed a lot of people's thinking on stuff. It is still in print today. So it kind of is an evergreen business book that you still see schools talking about and stuff like that. And to me, what's striking about this book, by the way, it's a good book. It's worth reading, but I'm gonna pick on something because it's a great example of what happens to us. They made 9 predictions right at the front of the book in the first chapter of things that were about to happen. Standing on the verge of these massive changes that are going to drive entirely new industries that are going to revolutionize everything. So it's been 27 years since the book was written. I want to look back at those 9 predictions, and this will kind of tell us something. So prediction number 1, miniature robots built from atomic particles that could unclog sclerotic arteries. Man, that's hard to say. Okay, number 1, there's a little issue with wording here. I think everything is built from atomic particles last time I checked, so I'm not quite sure what they were trying to get to. But anyway, the vision was we're going to be able to miniaturize these little robots that will crawl around inside your bodies. This was 27 years ago. This was supposed to be imminent. And they will fix things. And there was actually a movie in the 1960s where human beings got shrunk down. And, so this was kind of harking back to that idea and stuff like that. We haven't gotten there 27 years later. About the closest that we've gotten is the thing that you can see that guy holding. So it's about the size of half a AA battery. You're supposed to swallow it, which really scares me. And it's a little miniaturized camera that's supposed to go through your digestive tract and take pictures, which is kind of cool. I mean, I like that idea. That's a beginning. I worry that the process of swallowing it might kill you, but presumably the doctors would watch and you'd be okay. But that's about the closest that we've gotten to this vision, and it isn't anywhere close to what they were talking about. So this one didn't happen. Next one, telephone switches and other devices that provide real-time translation between people in different languages. Well, okay, we're getting toward this. I mean, you've got this today for definitely for text. It's pretty reliable at this point. Speech, a lot of it depends on accent and which exact languages and stuff like that. I don't think we're really there at the point yet where you could be sitting next to a stranger from another country on a train and have a live conversation with them, and that would just go really great. But we're making a lot of progress toward this. But it's been a really slow slog. And remember, 27 years ago, this was called imminent. And so that part didn't really happen. Third one, digital highways into the home that will offer access to the world's store of knowledge and entertainment. Oh my God, absolutely on target, absolutely happened. That one's really great. On the other hand, I'm not trying to criticize, but at the time they wrote this, America Online was already a decade old. Netscape had already been founded. The web was kind of coming. So it's not so much a forecast or a prediction out of the blue as it was just an extrapolation from what was already happening. But nevertheless, they got this one right, and so I'm fully willing to give them credit for this. Next one, urban underground automated distribution systems that will reduce traffic congestion. I don't know. I'm not even sure what this was supposed to be. Maybe this is Elon Musk's vision of having tunnels under cities or something like that. Could well be, but the way we worked out distribution to reduce traffic congestions was just to have the trucks drive at night, and so we didn't need to dig a bunch of tunnels and stuff. So I'm not sure where they were going with this one. Next one, virtual meeting rooms that will save people the wear and tear of air travel. Okay, well, virtual meeting rooms, we're in one now. It's cool. It actually works. It did take most of the 27 years before it reached critical mass. There were companies working on it for a long time beforehand. I thought it was really interesting that they said this is going to reduce the wear and tear of air travel, which actually Air travel did not go down as video conferencing started to appear. What happened was we had a pandemic that forced us all to get together, and it saved the economy from, I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't had that available. So interesting take on the technology. It took a lot longer to arrive than we expected. And also the problem that it solved was very different from what they were talking about, which itself I think is really, really interesting. Next one, biomimetic materials that will duplicate the wondrous properties of materials found in the real world. Um, even by 2008, National Geographic was taking shots at this one, saying that it's not really happening. Even the word biomimetic, so this is Google search popularity for that word. You can see the word itself is dying. There has been some effort around this, but it hasn't been the sort of revolution that they were talking about. Next one, satellite-based personal communicators that let you phone home from anywhere on the planet. Well, okay, so you can phone home from everywhere, but it's definitely not satellite-based for most of us. There are sat phones. They're twice the weight of a smartphone. They have really dinky screens. The phone costs $800, and the phone service is $1 a minute. You're not going to be doing a bunch of web browsing with that. So this is one where there was a competitive issue that just caused this particular technology not to reach critical mass. I also think that dollar a minute would have been a stopper for most of us in any case. Next one, machines capable of emotion, inference, and learning. Okay, so that was supposed to be imminent 27 years ago. It is still imminent today. Don't hold your breath. Next one, bioremediation. We're going to custom design little organisms like little bacteria that will clean up the Earth's environment. Absolutely has not happened. It's illegal to try to do this in a number of places. What we have done is picking out real world bugs that like would help with bioremediation. So there's been some effort, but this idea of custom designed organisms not happening yet. So you add it all up, and there's marginal stuff and things like that, but it's about 3 for 9 in terms of correctness. So about 1 in 3. One of the big issues is it's not just a matter of being correct. You have to also say when it's going to happen. So even if in the future, like satellite phones maybe eventually become practical, you've still got companies that lost enormous amounts of money believing that it was going to happen earlier. Motorola dropped $2.6 billion on the Iridium satellite phone system. It's one of the reasons why they're not around today. They were labeled Edsels in the sky by Wired, which is pretty cutting when Wired called you something like that. So we got a problem not just with accuracy of predictions, but also timing on how to get the timing right so you can make a business investment. So why did the predictions fail? Well, some of them, they just didn't solve a compelling problem, like the underground delivery tunnels. Some of them were implemented wrong, like video conferencing. For a long time, the emphasis was on making giant video conferencing rooms, like Cisco was doing those things that cost like $3 million, and it would let a company in Tokyo talk to a company in the US. Okay, fine, but actually doing it through our laptop computers turned out to be way better. Sometimes it was competition. That's what happened to the sat phones. In a lot of cases, what happened was that the authors mistook a technology that they could describe for a technology that actually could be caused to work today. Paul Sappho, a futurist, had a great quote on this. He said, "Never mistake a clear view for a short distance." We constantly do that. We see something that sounds like it's going to be practical because we can imagine it, and maybe, somebody can even mock up a little demo, and we assume that, oh, that's just a really short path in order to make it practical to use. And very, very, very often that is not the case. So that's the situation on why it kind of sucks to try to predict the future. Next, let me talk about some of the ways that I've seen companies try to cope with that and the problems that that creates for them. So what you have here is an inverted bell curve. And it's my way of drawing out the fact that companies tend to cluster in one of two ways of looking at the future. You get some companies that I would label visionary, which are usually led by somebody who's really, really smart. Often it's a founder-led organization, and they believe they can drive and control the future. And then you get analytical companies at the other extreme, which believe that through proper creation of spreadsheets and presentations and proper research and all this other stuff, you can produce accurate predictions of the future, and then you drive your company planning based on your reaction to those predictions. So most companies tend to lean one way or another. It's very, very rare to find one that's an exact mix between the two. Furthermore, this chart is not really to scale because most companies lean on the analytical side. The visionary ones are relatively smaller in number. So to give you some examples, when we say visionary, it's real easy to think of some prominent companies that have gotten that way. Everything Elon Musk does is driven by Elon's vision. Amazon, whatever you might think about the relative popularity of Amazon today, what they did with online shopping and then with web data, those were amazing visionary things that they did. Apple, led by an absolutely charismatic visionary that did a lot of amazing stuff. On the other hand, there are a lot of visionary companies that crash and burn horribly. So Palm, 6 years of my freaking life, and I can tell you it was really visionary driven and it did not work out great for us. The DeLorean Motor Car Company, the only reason people remember DeLorean today is because that's the car in Back to the Future. Other than that, really not a big commercial success. One that I love personally, upper right hand corner, that is the Roton rotary rocket. Okay, that's real. That was in, I think it was the 1990s. So this is pre-SpaceX. And it was going to be a rocket that was launched on rocket power. And when it returned to Earth, rather than having parachutes, it had jet powered helicopter blades that would spin really fast to slow it down and bring it back to Earth. And they built prototypes. They went on for years and years. They raised a bunch of money. It didn't work out for them. They ran out of money. The company's completely dead today. That little prototype that you see there is someplace in Mojave on display as being, memories of our ancestors who tried to do things that didn't work out. So the visionary companies sometimes go big, very often complete collapse. Analytical companies include a lot of the big ones that have been around for a long time, and it's easy to think of these. Some of them started as visionary and they eventually evolved into analytical. Some of them have been analytical from the start, but there are lots and lots of examples like this. So, strengths and weaknesses. The analytical companies are really good at responding rapidly to market changes because they are always listening and always evaluating. They're very good at optimizing costs and efficiency and all that sort of stuff. In a predictable market that's not changing, they can do really, really well. And so they are relentless in those sorts of industries. They're the people who will cut costs by 3% a year and just drive everyone else into bankruptcy. They have big weaknesses, though. Because they are doing this group analytical thing, they are very vulnerable to groupthink. If they are in a stable industry that changes suddenly, it is very hard for them to cope with that at all. They tend to focus on tangible short-term things rather than intangible long-term things because those things are harder to analyze, right? And they manage for things they can analyze. It's very hard for them to differentiate because they tend not to have original ideas. Everybody does the same analysis, they come to the same conclusions. They also tend to have mission drift. So what will happen is even if they have an idea of something they're trying to pursue in the market, because they're focused on being responsive to stuff that's happening, they will evolve themselves away from that original mission. That can be good, but also can result in companies just completely getting lost sometimes. So on the other hand, for the visionary companies, they're very focused. They're very decisive because they tend to be leader led. They stay on course and they're willing to invest in the long term. Look how long Amazon was willing to lose money, decades to establish what they wanted to do. Look what Elon is doing today, with his companies. The weaknesses, they will ignore market data. So even if there's stuff that invalidates their original idea, they just tend to ignore that stuff. Steve Jobs really didn't like market research. It's like that's going to distract me from the vision. I don't want to hear about this sort of stuff. And I'm not trying to speak for him, but that's the sort of behavior that I saw. They tend to ignore outside input because the outsiders just aren't as visionary as we are. And so these companies are vulnerable to if the leader gets the wrong idea, if the vision fails, they can very cheerfully walk completely off a cliff and be totally destroyed without even realizing what's happening. So they're wonderful until they fail spectacularly. All right, so there's an example on this. I witnessed this one because I was involved in the early days of smartphones when I was at Palm. And you had a bunch of companies that were trying to iteratively evolve toward doing a smarter phone by like bringing in little bits of text information and stuff like that and evolving. We were trying to evolve PDAs in order to make them into phones and stuff like that. And that was kind of an analytically driven process. There were some more visionary companies, like I'd say the BlackBerry people, the ones who did the text messaging and email messaging phones. They were really pursuing a different vision. The idea was you would have a keyboard built into these things, and there were certain tasks you could do with them. And they were very, very popular. They were extremely successful for a long time. At a time, this was the leading smartphone in the United States. But then something happened called Apple, and they came up with a completely different concept, which is, hey, get rid of the keyboard so that we can have a really big screen. You're going to use that screen to browse the web. We're going to make it a great web browser because all the mobile web browsers before then had been sucky. We're also going to bundle it with a music player, which they already had a big business around, so they could leverage that music business. And they basically stole the entire smartphone industry because Steve had the right vision. And you know, this is the quote everybody always likes to use to beat up the people who are trying to compete with Steve. This is Steve Ballmer, at the time CEO of Microsoft. Now he owns a basketball team, so that tells you how things worked out. And he was talking about how much he disliked Apple's strategy and how it didn't fit with the viewpoint of people who were looking at this analytical stuff. Now, you know, Ballmer was also trying to wish away the competition. He was a sales and marketing guy, and so part of this is just the rhetoric that he was using. But nevertheless, Microsoft also had this kind of attitude. So I think the answer, the lesson from this entire presentation so far is the way to deal with the future is to be Steve Jobs. And if you're Steve, that's great. Go for it. Drive your company. That's absolutely fine. Unfortunately, I'm not Steve. I don't think any of us actually are. And so what do we do about this? And that's what I want to talk about next. So I believe, my opinion, we need to change the way we think about the future. The most important thing about the future is that it hasn't happened yet. Now that sounds like kind of trite and silly and stuff like that, but I want you to think about that really carefully. Because it hasn't happened, it cannot be predicted. In its nature, it is impossible to predict the future. If you could, go get rich on the stock market and share some money with me, please. But it can't. It also can't be completely controlled and driven. However, it can be influenced. And I've seen a lot of cases in my career when there have been possibilities to kind of nudge the future toward the direction that you want to go. What you really want is some sort of map that will give you an idea of what possibilities there are in the future. And think about this. This is a little bit old school, but you know, for a long time for me, the way I would plan like family vacations is we'd get all the maps from the auto club, and then we'd go and we'd look at all the places we could go and how do we string it together. And we go, oh, we could go to this park and then we could drive to this place and that sort of stuff. And we'd plan out an itinerary that was all driven by the locations of things that we wanted to get to and by the road network that would let us go there. And we could plan out what would be the most fun vacation that way. I want you to start thinking about the future that way. Drawing out a map, not of what's going to happen, but what are the possibilities that might happen, so you can think about the destinations that you want to go toward. And building out this sort of possibility map includes taking information from several places. You need to know about technology futures, like what might be possibly built. You need insight on where the competitors are going because they're going to block you from going to certain places on the map. And you need to really understand customer psychology, which is like the places you could go to, the markets that you could serve. And you need to integrate those three perspectives into a single view to build that map of possibilities. So for a visionary company, what this map can do is enrich the vision of the founder or whoever's driving the vision, you know, and identify those cliffs before you march off of them. So it's not a matter of replacing the vision. It's a matter of making sure that the vision has been properly vetted and that it's been enriched by this additional information. For an analytical company, the map can be a tool for thinking more creatively, fleshing out what the long-term opportunities could be, making them more vivid and more well described so that the analytical company can respond to them, and kind of a way of breaking or challenging the consensus that those analytic companies tend to fall into. So let's talk about how you build that map. So first of all, if you're looking at technology possibilities, I've watched a lot of things over time where we thought stuff was imminent and then it didn't turn out happening. And the best way to counter that is, first of all, to talk to really bright practitioners. You don't just want consultants because sometimes they're too detached from the day-to-day realities of what's going on. It's really good to get really smart people who are directly involved in building stuff rather than just observing. You want them to be experienced enough to have failed a few times. You don't want them to be too young because then they don't realize how things can go bad, but you don't want them to be so experienced that they've graduated into only doing consulting and they start to kind of lose touch. So what you want to do with these people is ask them what's coming, what's imminent, what are the cool new things that are going to be appearing, but you're going to filter that information very, very carefully. In particular, very often hardware stuff looks like it's about to become real way far before it actually does. So when I was back at Palm in about the year 2000, we were looking at future technology things that could really revolutionize mobile devices. And the thing we focused down on was flexible screens because at that time there were companies working on flexible screens. And think about it, if you had a flexible screen today that really worked well, you could make a smartphone that was the size of like a lipstick dispenser, really tiny, easily fit in a purse or a pocket or something like that. And when you want to look at and when you want to talk on it, you could just hold it up really easily. It's really tiny, hold it up to your face. It's got a little microphone, a little speaker, kind of almost like an earbud, just slightly larger than that. But then when you want to look at data, ooh, I'm going to unscroll the screen or I'm going to unfold it. Maybe it's like a Japanese fan. It's a little thing that folds out. And then I have a big screen that I can look at. And there were people talking about making flexible screens. And so we got together with our advanced technology guys. We had a bunch of them. We said, based on what we're seeing, 2003. We're going to be able to get bendable screens by 2003, and therefore we should be planning on this stuff. Now, we didn't get to the point of actually building the prototypes and stuff, but we were seriously thinking that that was the next big breakthrough in mobile devices. So here we are 20 years later, just barely starting to appear. Why? Because there were problems with producing the screens. You're bending the screen all the time and it breaks all little wires that are in there, all the little electronic connections, and all the pixels start dropping out after you flexed it about 15 times. The industry has spent the last 20 years trying to figure out how to solve that problem, and we're just barely starting to get there now. So that was a perfect example of a really clear view of where we were going to go, but the distance was not short at all. So my general rule for any hardware component is if it is not actually starting to come off a factory floor in small quantities, it is not real and you do not know when it's going to be real. Software, somewhat similar. Different types of software. If it's really straightforward to build a piece of software, then you can usually do a pretty good prediction on how long it's going to take. If the software involves new functionality, that you're not, any new science, any new, we're not sure of the algorithms, we're not sure if the algorithm's going to work, something like that, you have no idea when it's going to be done. And you cannot plan on the basis that you've got it. So you may know possibilities. You can figure out, okay, when am I going to know if this is good enough that we can start planning for it? Like, okay, maybe I'm going to track the factories and I'm going to see when they can start giving me real working prototypes that we can start to play with, stuff like that. So you can anticipate what the future possibilities might be. You can start to build that map, but you don't lock stuff in hard and make hard business planning assumptions around it. You don't spend an enormous amount of money until the stuff's a little bit more real. Now, so you get all that stuff, but you don't stop with the technology. A lot of companies make that mistake. The problem is engineers fall in love with the things that they can do with their technologies. And a lot of times customers don't fall in love with it the same way. So this is a data point. You start with that, but you've got to move deeper. So the next thing is learning to anticipate customer reactions to things. So it's not asking them what they're going to think about a completely new product because people can't predict how they're going to behave in the future and what they're going to think. When I was at Apple, we used to try to ask Mac owners what they would like to have as new features in the Macintosh. We did all these surveys and stuff like that. The surveys always came back with what they wanted was bigger hard drives and more memory because that's the consensus thing that everybody knows that they want. When we asked them about multimedia features like, ooh, the ability to edit videos and stuff like that, 10% of the customers said they were super excited. 90% of the customers said they were not interested. We said, well, crap, why would we want to work on that? Because only 10% of people were interested in it. Well, then Steve Jobs came back to the company because I was there at a time when he wasn't there. Steve Jobs came back and he said, you people are morons. Let's go invest in multimedia. And what he got was a differentiated product that he could delight people with. He made multimedia into something that they wanted, and he rescued the Macintosh. And the roots of that also drove the iPhone. So, it was getting an understanding of what would delight people if you could do it for them, as opposed to asking them what they want. That means you need to spend an enormous amount of time listening to customers so you can become a proxy for them, their problems, their needs, how they react to other products. You want to do enough of these conversations that you can start predicting what these people are going to say before they say it. You build an understanding of them into your head so that you can forecast what they're going to respond to. Somebody like a Steve Jobs does that intuitively. That's great for him. Other people can learn to do this through having enough customer conversations. Now, the challenge here is that doing this through traditional interviews is an enormous pain in the neck. It's hard to recruit. It takes a lot of time to set this stuff up. You usually don't have the time to do it. And so we skimp on it. We do a small number of interviews, or we just interview friends and family, or maybe other people in the company. None of that stuff is accurate. So technologically, the company that I've been working at, and there are a number of other companies doing this as well, we've been working on make it super easy to have interactions with customers. You don't even have to interview them live anymore. What you can do is make up a list of questions, have them answer that stuff on video. You can get automatic recruiting of the people you want. You get the results back in less than a day, so it's really, really fast. And all you have to do is skim through the videos and you'll understand what they're talking about. So that's what I encourage you to do today. I do have the little example of that because I want you to have a feel for the sort of stuff that you can do. So on the next slide, this is like a 1.5-minute video showing you the types of feedback that you can get through these systems. These are all real world examples of real customer feedback. These are all things that were produced in less than a day.
This hood just like wasn't wasn't quite right for me, and maybe I can show you. It's like a good shape for my head, but this bill is just weird.
I'm open to telehealth, but I would prefer to go to an urgent care walk-in clinic because how would they know? Would they have me push my finger and tell them what I feel? I don't know what I'm feeling.
Find a pair of women's tennis shoes you would like that are white, size 9, and under $50. And it's showing me Halloween costumes.
The graphics are intriguing, so I like that. What I didn't like was it's trying to pull me into the application before I even get some information about it.
How did I get in here? Why would I want to dial somebody?
Okay, save $1 on that one too.
It just kind of seems like a picture that my mom used to have in her dining room, like in the 80s. So it makes me feel kind of depressed a little bit.
Shelter in place, yeah. If I saw that, I would immediately close whatever I saw it. If it was print, I'd throw it in the trash. And if it was a company, I would do my best to not shop there ever again.
Oh my God, this ad. This plays on my Hulu like nonstop. I love this ad.
All right, you get the idea. So, people tend to think about usability testing as being something that you do just for perfecting a product feature. And you saw some samples in there. The thing I want you to understand is it's actually just a really, it's a technology for getting very rapid feedback on anything you can ask a customer about. And so think of ways you can apply that to your process of learning how customers think and getting inside their heads. So then the other piece of this future possibility map is competitors. And what you're trying to do with competitors actually is very similar to what you're trying to do with customers. You want to get inside the heads of these companies because every competitor has its own personalities. And the personalities and the behaviors of the company, its business practices make it predictable so you can anticipate what it's likely to do in the future. So the way you get to this is you read all their marketing materials, you use their products. And this can be hard in B2B to get access to somebody else's products and be able to play with them. But you really need to do that because a lot of the company's psychology is reflected in the way they design the interface, the way the product works, which features they make most prominent. All of that sort of stuff tells you how they think and therefore how they're likely to behave in the future. Also, a great thing to do is if there are conferences, once we're back to having live conferences, you go to those conferences and you talk to their employees, ask them questions about what they're thinking, challenge them on stuff, see how they respond. And throughout this stuff, there are questions you want to be asking yourself. Who are they designing this for? Who do they picture as being their customer? What trade-offs are they making in product design and why? What assumptions are they making about the customers? What are their beliefs that they're reflecting in their product? What are they really good at doing? Because they'll try doing more of that in the future. Where do they invest their time? And you add all that stuff together and it gives you a picture of how they're likely to behave in the future scenarios that you're drawing. This is not an easy thing to do. It requires somebody who's a really good intuitive thinker. They need to spend a lot of time building up the information. It's a senior employee you need to be using for this. This is not something that a junior intern is going to do. And unfortunately, lots of companies, who do they throw into the competitive analysis function? It's the junior interns that they just hired. Oh, go here and learn the business. They're not going to be able to give you this sort of insight, unfortunately. So then you need to draw the map. So you get those perspectives together. You start with the customer needs because that's the landscape, the potential places that you could go. Here are the problems that they have that we could go try to solve. You layer in the technologies because that tells you whether or not you're going to be able to serve those needs. Oh, here's a technology coming along. We could apply it to that problem we were just talking about. It gives me a new perspective. That's really cool. Then you layer on top of that the competitors. So if this situation happens, do they have an adjacent technology that they already own? Do they have a patent portfolio that's going to make it difficult for us to operate there? Do they have a product adjacent? How are they likely to respond when it starts to become clear that we're going in that direction? And then you can anticipate, okay, what do I do to block them off before they get there? So before they even get the idea of coming after us, you're going to find ways to insulate your stuff from that. It's thinking several steps ahead about both the marketplace and about the competitors. If you're working within a company, all this information eventually goes into a presentation. It's a series of 1 to 2 slides per issue laying out the evidence. If you're presenting this up to a senior management team, you separate the evidence from the implications, what you think the company should do, because you want to make it not just a, I'm forcing you to do this, but it's a thought document. It's an explanation document. You want to drive discussion. And then you present this stuff to the leadership team. You make sure you got a lot of time to talk about it, like an afternoon or maybe an offsite, where you're going to then have a big debate and discussion about it. And together you will figure out, what do you think this future map of possibilities looks like, and which possibilities do you want to go after and why? It's harder to do this the larger your company is. In really big companies, unfortunately, you usually have a separate competitive analysis team which has some junior people doing data collection in most cases. You have a separate market research team, which usually is focused on running surveys and opinion tracking. I'm not trying to denigrate market researchers, but that's usually the centerpiece of the work. And then you have a totally separate advanced technology team, which is a bunch of really senior engineers and scientists. All three of those groups usually operate completely separately. They don't talk to each other. They don't even respect each other because they don't value each other's works. So in that sort of situation, you need to get those groups together and you need to do a cultural intervention to get them to to value the work of each other. So you need a company leader who respects each of those functions and will make it really clear that they're expected to work together. You ask them to work on cross-disciplinary projects to give all their perspectives together. And you keep doing that until they start respecting each other's perspectives. You give them shared projects and reports about the future, stuff like that. And somebody needs to engage closely to drive this process to make these things mix together, because otherwise they will naturally separate out and they won't tend to work with each other, and you'll never get the sort of map that you need to get. So this is a management challenge. It's a culture change challenge. It has to be driven very deliberately and very carefully in order to make it work. I've worked on this sort of stuff at companies. So if you're in that sort of situation where you want to try to drive this, drop me a note. I'd be glad to let you know what worked for me and what didn't work. So hopefully can save you a little bit of time. So that's kind of my view on the future and how to deal with it. So the stuff I want you to remember out of this is, number one, we all stink at predicting the future because in its nature, it can't be predicted. And the question of when something is going to happen is even tougher than the question of what. I'm at the point where I don't really care about the what anymore. Tell me when, and that's what I really need to know. And that's the hardest thing to do. Both the analytical company and the visionary company approaches have flaws. You can make both of those basic approaches better if you can layer in a map of the future possibilities. And what you're looking to do is understand where you might be able to go so that you can't drive the future. You can't exactly predict it, but you can massage it. You're going to give it a back rub. You're going to encourage it to go in the right direction so that you've got a better chance of being successful. And the way you're going to understand those possibilities is by combining a deep understanding of how customers think and feel, not what they say, but what's inside their heads, a really realistic understanding of the technology possibilities and what can actually be built in the next few years versus what's theoretical, and then a good intuitive understanding of the way competitors will react so that you can outmaneuver them ahead of time. If you get it right, this can give you a much better chance of being successful. It's not perfect. It's not always going to work perfectly, but it'll increase your odds a whole bunch. There's a quote that I love by Alan Kay, another futurist, and he said, "The best way to predict the future is to invent it." I strongly agree with that. The problem is he didn't then describe how to invent the future. That was kind of left as an exercise. So this is my take on how you try to invent the future, is by using this sort of approach. Um, with that, I'm done. So there's my contact info. I would love to hear from you directly. Glad to have an ongoing conversation. But even more than that, I want to talk right now. So guys, fire away with questions and stuff.
Yeah, please pop some of your questions into the Q&A box. While you're doing that, we are going to put up a quick poll for you. So this is just about how smoothly the discussion ran for you, and what the Pragmatic team can do better to make these more enjoyable for you every time. So Mike, there were a couple questions that came through while you were chatting that you then beautifully answered in the flow of the conversation. So I'm going to skip those for the folks that asked them. I'm going to skip those ones because I think that Mike really beautifully answered those already. But if you don't feel like it was answered, please feel free to just pop it in again. Again, Q&A is the best spot for those. So the first thing that I want to ask you is about kind of those different archetypes of a visionary or an analytical company. Would you say that organizations gravitate towards one or the other?
Yeah.
Do you recommend one, or do you think the ideal is kind of to have a blend of both perspectives? What have you seen?
It's a great question. I think there tends to be an evolution over time. Smaller, newer companies tend to be a little bit vision-led. Sometimes they're analytical. They can start that way right from the start, depending on the character of the founders. But what you see a lot of times is there'll be an initial visionary leadership that's really good at doing stuff kind of intuitively. And then the torch gets passed at some point to kind of more analytical perspectives on things and a more analytical approach. You can see that evolution with a lot of the companies that I was talking about. And it's a pretty common thing to have happen just because visionaries are very hard to find. They're very rare people. And so you're just not going to run into them that often. As for which approach is right, I don't think either one is right or wrong. It's more a matter of being humble about understanding what your strengths and weaknesses are and then accommodating to it. And that's what I really want to emphasize, is to an analytical company, it's a little bit easier to sell this idea of future mapping, um, or possibility mapping, because it's kind of another form of analysis. And so they're used to doing analysis anyway. It's softer analysis. It's not as quantitative as what those companies tend to like, and so it can be a little hard for them culturally, but they tend to be able to deal with it. It's more a problem of an analytical company tends to be bigger. You've got these groups that really are not used to talking to each other, and it's very hard to get them to work together. That's the big obstacle there. Visionary companies, the big thing is that visionary founder or visionary senior executive, do they have enough humbleness to admit that they might be wrong? And often that's a really hard thing for them, because their whole history has been overcoming obstacles by being right when other people were telling them no. And they therefore they've learned that the way they're going to be successful is by ignoring what other people say. And so it's a matter of, are they self-aware enough to recognize that their vision could be even better if they had more input. It's not that the possibility map competes with the vision. It gives a more rigorous way for the person with the vision to test and inform and make their vision even richer. If it's presented that way, it usually goes down pretty well. If it's presented as something that competes with the founder's vision, a lot of times it kind of makes them insecure, like somebody's going to be interfering with my ability to steer the company, and they really do not appreciate that.
Makes sense. And there's another question about the possibility map that I want to dig in on a little bit.
Yeah.
Who is the one that is usually presenting that? Who's putting that together? What kind of role do you see kind of in charge of the possibility map if it's not the visionaries themselves?
Yeah. Somebody who's senior enough to be able to pull together those perspectives, and who is trusted enough to do it. So, usually it'll be director, VP level, that sort of stuff. And you can have people in strategy roles. It could be product management. A lot, this is a great thing for product managers to do, to be bringing all these perspectives together. They should be doing that. Could be product marketing, could be company strategy. I do some of this stuff at UserTesting. My title's market strategy, but emphasis on the word strategy. So it needs to be somebody who's taking a broader view of your longer term direction and who has the ability to reach cross-functionally across the company, because it does need to be a cross-functional thing. In companies where product managers are empowered to take on that sort of cross-functional role, where they're not just kind of project managers, it's, to me, this is a natural for like an outbound product management exec, that sort of thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Pivoting a little bit, there's a couple questions here about competitive analysis, competitive intelligence. So someone's putting together a competitive intelligence framework and is curious what some of the key categories of information that they should be looking at, what that should be included in that.
Oh boy, that's a great one. Well, number one, this is kind of like I'm trying to evade the question. I'm not. To me, the most important thing is getting a sense of the gestalt, like how it all adds together. There's the what's his name? Michael Porter wrote the big book on competitive intelligence, and it's all about how you're supposed to do all these charts and tables and fill them all in, and that's going to tell you what the competitive stuff is. I'm not a huge fan of Michael Porter, to be really, really honest. Not that I don't have anything against the human being, but just that approach. It's kind of like if you gather enough analytical stuff, it'll somehow magically transform. My take is, when you're looking at competitors, what you really want to do is get a good intuitive sense of how they think, because that's what lets you predict what they're likely to do. And so what you want to do is gather all the data that will feed your intuition and will give you a better sense of it. And that is all the traditional stuff. You want to know about their financials. You want to know about their investors, if they are still investor controlled, like a startup or something like that, because the direction that the investors are looking for will help guide you towards some of the stuff that they'll be under pressure to do. The things that individual investors have said about their market for a non-public company, that can be really, really useful stuff. You look at their marketing, because the way they describe things tells you how they think. The structure of their website, what do they feature? What does it say right on the front? A lot of times you can look at the homepage of a company and you can understand so much about how they think just from how do they present themselves. Now, there can be exceptions, especially if they hired a consultancy to do the homepage for them, and then you're getting the attitudes of the consultancy. But if you gather a lot of these tells, how do they pitch themselves? What documents do they give to customers? You don't want to solicit confidential stuff, but things that's not labeled confidential. Any data point that you can give that gives you a different angle. Talk to their former employees. That can be a great one. Don't solicit confidential information, but just, what was it like to work there? What were you guys focused on? You'd be amazed at general stuff you can learn about how they think. The more disparate data points, you load them all up in your head, or you get a few people to load them up in their heads and then talk about it. And you just start to get a picture for how these guys are thinking, how they're going to operate, what's going to go on. And that's what lets you start to anticipate their future behavior. So it's not so much competitive intelligence as it is competitive understanding. And it's very separate from the other competitive thing that you need to do, which is gathering data points for the sales team. And so you don't want to confuse those two things. You got to feed the sales team with the data points that they need and with the stuff to say. This is a separate thing about gaining understanding and therefore being able to predict a little bit.
Small question related to competitors. Is it ever appropriate to ask your customers about your competitors, or is that kind of does that not look good on you?
Great question. Yes, you want to do it. And in fact, I do that all the time. It's, you don't want to make it sound like you're insecure or something like that, but it's just like, hey, we're trying to make our product better and we're trying to learn from what our competitors are doing. And would you like to share any impressions? We've got some customers who use both our product and the competition's product. And we just ask them, hey, can you show us? Can you tell us what you like and dislike? Tell us what you love about the other thing. And usually people are glad to talk about that stuff because it's very flattering to be asked for your opinions. What do you think? What would you do? You don't necessarily follow everything that they tell you, but you get all sorts of good little tidbits. But again, it's not soliciting confidential information. So I will say, hey, do you want to share that piece of collateral that they gave to you? That's great. But if it says confidential on it, it goes straight into the trash. I don't even look at it because I don't want to create liability for my company. And furthermore, competitive stuff can be a slippery slope where it's easy to fall into trying to do all these corny spy things, some of which is very dubious ethically. You don't want to start down that slope. That ends up screwing you up over time. And you don't need it. Besides, there's tons of publicly available information. You can find what you need other ways.
I'll add to that. My husband is in sales, not looking for the same type of market feedback, but he has a question. I overhear him on the phone ask all the time. That is, if our competitor X called you for a meeting, would you take the meeting? And it actually has been picked up now by his product team, and they've started to ask the question as well.
Great.
It's an interesting question, and you have to be tough though, because sometimes they say yes.
Yeah. Well, and isn't that a valuable gift that they're giving you by saying yes? And my guess would be the follow-up conversation about why would be the most interesting piece of all.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd love to that. You've got to be willing to encounter information that bruises your ego a little bit. And that's true of technology. You'll fall in love with some technology that people are talking about. And it's the worst thing in the world to hear that it's really not practical yet, because you get your heart set on it and companies get their heart set on certain ideas. And you've got to be willing to just be a little bit ruthless about, nope, that's not it, guys. It's not come together that way. And sorry, we've got to think about it differently.
Yeah. All right, a little bit of a pivot for you. I think you're going to like this one. This is kind of a scenario based.
Oh, cool.
So we've got somebody who is working with a really visionary product from a small company and is working to position that for resale to a really large analytical company. How would you go about that? Do you have any advice? How would you market it? What do you think?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So a visionary product being sold to an analytical company. So definitely what you don't want to do is just push the vision because they'll tune that out. I would say try for as much practical validation as you can. Since an analytical company likes to get data, can you get data of some customers reacting to the idea? Could be you could use a system like ours to get video, or it could just be quotes, or it could be, anything that's objective and independent that says to this target company, hey, this is real. It doesn't have to be quantitative data, but anything that gives proof points or suggestions or directions. Are there ways that they could validate it as they go along? So rather than trying to drive an initial home run where they completely commit, can you give them tastes along the way and ways to try things out? Basically, if it's an analytical company, you need to engage their analytical process. Good to have the vision, but you can't expect them to sign on just because of the vision. You have to satisfy that rational thinking, being able to work stuff through deliberately. And the more you can feed that process for them, even if you don't have proof, right? Because for a brand new product, you usually don't have the success story that says company X saved $3 billion. Nice to have that, but that's fantasy land for most new products. But any little proof points, any validation, any people saying the right things about it, All of that stuff can add up. Analysts saying that the idea is a good one, that sort of stuff can be good evidence as well.
Really good advice. Really good advice. And a good
Cool.
question too.
Oh, that's a great question. I love it. Good luck with that situation.
All right, I'm going to try to jam 2 more in before
Cool.
the end of our time. A lot of feedback about the awesome video that you shared. Everybody loved the awesome user feedback,
Neat.
which of course you should all check out UserTesting. So the wondering in relation to that though, if you're using a kind of tool like that or really getting feedback anywhere from
Yeah.
your users, at what stage does that feedback matter the most? How mature should your product be in order to get the most valuable insights out of it?
Early and often. So what a lot of companies will do is that they assume that this sort of feedback gathering is like market research. And what they say is, okay, I'm going to wait until our idea or our product is really pretty mature, like maybe close to release, because then I can show them the whole thing. And then I'm going to do a really large sample size, because, hey, you're supposed to get large sample sizes. Somebody told me that in school. That is completely wrong. Because number one, with this sort of feedback where you're looking to get anecdotal stuff, it tends to converge pretty quickly after you get feedback from 6, 7, 8 people, stuff like that. You'll start to hear repeats. If you do the same thing with 50 people, what you get is 50 videos saying the same thing, and it's really not useful. What you're looking for is as you go along to identify really bad mistakes or to validate key decisions that you're making as early as possible before you invest in them further. It's a check to make sure you're not doing the wrong thing. And so very early stage ideas, you do discovery interviews. And by the way, do the discovery interviews self-guided. Don't do them where you're on the phone because people hold back on their opinions when they're talking to a human being. When they're talking just to their smartphone or their computer, it's much saltier. It's much more candid. It's almost confessional. You will get much higher quality feedback, believe it or not. Start very early when you're understanding their problems. When you start to get ideas on how to approach it, you do some validation on that. When you get sketches and prototypes, you validate those things. As you go along, you check repeatedly with small numbers of people. Far better to do a series of tests along the way that adds up to 50 or 100 participants over time, rather than waiting and doing 100 and finding out when the engineering is 80% done that you have to go back and start over. Do you really want to experience that? You want to find that out as early as you possibly can.
Yeah. All right, last one. I know I'm right on the minute here, folks. So you might have just answered this question in the previous one as well, but someone else who loves the user feedback videos, but they've got a product that users really can't take video of due to kind of proprietary information. So they're wondering what's a better way to get that feedback and that kind of caliber of feedback that maybe isn't an interview or a questionnaire. Are there any kind of other things?
So number one, you could have them use it off camera and then go on camera to talk to you about it. So you can set it up so you're not recording their screen, you're just recording their face, and have them talk about it. Second is if you want to see it actually in operation, if there are cases where it just can't be recorded because of confidentiality, can you get them to just meet with you? Can you go to their location and talk with them about it? It's not nearly as convenient as doing this stuff remotely, but sometimes you have to do it that way because of circumstances. But definitely, one way or another, either getting them to talk about it separately or going to their location or a combination of both, you really do want to get that feedback. You got to find some way to get it.
Awesome. Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you so much. I am going to wrap us up because I know folks are going to have to drop for all their hard stops. We're a minute over here. This is fantastic. I really enjoyed this a ton. Everybody on the line, keep an eye out for an email from us in the coming days. You will get a recording of these of this presentation and the slides. Mike has also been super generous and shared kind of a goodie for you. So there'll be an ebook in there for you as well. So keep an eye in there. Sounds like everyone really enjoyed this. Tons of awesome comments here coming in and compliments for you, Mike. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody. And if folks have other follow-up questions and stuff, you got my email right there, mike@usertesting.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Awesome. Bye, everybody. See you next time.